The morning sun cast long shadows across the marble floors of Buckingham Palace as Camilla Richardson adjusted her crisp uniform one final time. She had served as a royal guard for 12 years, protecting the Queen with unwavering loyalty and dedication. Her son Marcus, now 22, had grown up within these very walls, playing quietly in the servants' quarters while she worked her shifts. The Queen had always been kind to both of them. When Marcus was younger, she would sometimes stop to chat with him during her evening walks through the palace corridors. The elderly monarch had even helped pay for his education, ensuring he could attend university despite their modest means. Camilla felt blessed to work for such a generous woman who treated her staff like family. But everything changed on that cold February morning when the Queen passed away peacefully in her sleep. The entire palace fell into mourning, and Camilla wept genuine tears for the woman who had been more than just her employer. The funeral preparations began immediately, and the palace buzzed with activity as dignitaries from around the world prepared to pay their respects. During this chaotic time, Camilla noticed something troubling. Several valuable items that belonged personally to the Queen had been left unattended in her private chambers. Precious jewelry, rare books, antique silverware, and even some of the Queen's favorite paintings were sitting there, seemingly forgotten in the rush to organize the state funeral. Marcus visited his mother that evening looking worried and stressed. He had recently graduated with massive student loans hanging over his head, and his job search had been unsuccessful. The economic downturn had made finding work nearly impossible for someone his age, and he was struggling to make ends meet while living in a tiny apartment across town. As they sat in the small break room reserved for palace staff, Marcus confided his financial fears to his mother. The bills were piling up, and he was afraid he might lose his apartment soon. Camilla listened with a heavy heart, wishing she could do more to help her son. Her salary as a guard was decent, but not enough to cover both their expenses and his mounting debts. That night, Camilla found herself walking past the Queen's chambers during her patrol. The door stood slightly ajar, and she could see the valuable items still sitting there untouched. A dangerous thought crept into her mind. With all the confusion surrounding the funeral arrangements, would anyone really notice if a few small items went missing? The Queen was gone, and these possessions would likely end up in storage or be distributed among distant relatives who had never even met her. She tried to push these thoughts away, reminding herself of her oath of loyalty and the trust the Queen had placed in her. But as the days passed and Marcus's situation grew more desperate, the temptation became harder to resist. He called her crying one evening, explaining that his landlord had given him an eviction notice. He had 2 weeks to come up with 3 months' rent or he would be homeless. Camilla barely slept that night, wrestling with her conscience. She had always been an honest woman who took pride in her integrity. The Queen had trusted her with access to the most private areas of the palace, and she had never betrayed that trust before. But seeing her son's pain and desperation was breaking her heart. She was his mother, and wasn't it her duty to protect him by any means necessary? The next morning, while conducting her regular security rounds, Camilla made a decision that would change both their lives forever. She carefully selected a small diamond brooch that had belonged to the Queen, one that was sitting forgotten on a dresser among dozens of other pieces. It was beautiful, but not particularly famous or historically significant. Surely no one would miss just this one item. Her hands trembled as she slipped the brooch into her pocket. The weight of it felt enormous, like it might burn a hole right through her uniform. She completed her shift in a daze, jumping at every sound and avoiding eye contact with her colleagues. When she finally made it home that evening, she stared at the brooch for hours, hardly believing what she had done. Marcus was shocked when she showed it to him. At first, he refused to have anything to do with it, understanding immediately where it had come from. But when Camilla explained that it could solve his housing crisis and give them both a fresh start, his resolve began to weaken. They researched its potential value online and discovered it could be worth enough to pay off his debts and provide them with a substantial safety net. The moral weight of their decision pressed down on both of them. They spent several sleepless nights discussing whether to return the brooch and confess what had happened. Camilla knew she would lose her job immediately, but perhaps the royal family would show mercy given her years of faithful service. Marcus argued that coming clean now would only make their situation worse without helping anyone. Finally, Desperation won out over conscience. They decided to sell the brooch to a private collector, who asked no questions about its origin. The transaction was completed quickly and quietly, netting them more money than either had ever seen at once. Marcus was able to pay his rent and debts, while Camilla felt a mixture of relief and growing guilt. But one theft led to another. Now that they had crossed the line once, it became easier to justify taking more items. Over the following weeks, Camilla carefully selected small, valuable pieces that seemed unlikely to be missed immediately. A gold pen here, a silver letter opener there, some antique coins from a collection that numbered in the hundreds. Each theft became more calculated and bold. Marcus helped research the items online, finding buyers through discreet channels and private auction houses. They were careful to space out their sales and use different dealers to avoid suspicion. The money was life-changing for both of them, allowing Marcus to pursue his career ambitions and giving Camilla dreams of early retirement. Neither of them considered the inevitable consequences of their actions. They were so focused on their immediate relief and newfound financial freedom that they ignored the obvious fact that eventually, someone would notice the missing items. The Queen's personal effects were being cataloged for distribution, and palace security was always thorough in their investigations. As the weeks passed, Camilla found it increasingly difficult to look her fellow guards in the eye. She had betrayed not only the royal family but also her colleagues who trusted her. The weight of her secret grew heavier each day, but the fear of confession and its consequences kept her silent. She and Marcus had crossed a point of no return, and both of them were about to learn that some mistakes can never be undone. The palace inventory team arrived 3 weeks after the Queen's funeral, carrying clipboards and wearing serious expressions that made Camilla's stomach churn. She watched from her guard post as they filed into the Queen's private chambers, knowing that her crimes would soon be discovered. Her hands shook as she gripped her radio, trying to appear professional while her world crumbled around her. Marcus had been celebrating his newfound financial stability just that morning, excitedly telling his mother about a job interview he had secured with his improved circumstances. He had moved into a better apartment and even bought some new clothes with their ill-gotten gains. Neither of them had fully grasped that their actions would eventually catch up with them. The head of palace security, Director James Crawford, was a thorough man who had worked at the palace for over 20 years. He personally oversaw the cataloging of the Queen's possessions, cross-referencing every item against detailed records that had been maintained throughout her reign. It didn't take long for discrepancies to emerge. The first missing item to be noticed was actually the diamond brooch that Camilla had taken weeks earlier. Crawford frowned as he compared his list to what was physically present in the room. The brooch had been photographed for insurance purposes just 2 years prior, and there was no record of it being moved or gifted to anyone. This discovery prompted a more thorough search of the entire chamber. By the end of the first day, the inventory team had identified 7 missing items of significant value. The gold pen, silver letter opener, several antique coins, and 3 pieces of jewelry had all vanished without explanation. Crawford immediately sealed the Queen's chambers and called for a complete investigation. This was not a simple case of misplaced items, but a clear indication of theft. Camilla tried to maintain her composure as news of the missing items spread through the palace staff. Her fellow guards discussed the situation in hushed tones, expressing shock and anger that someone would dare steal from their beloved queen. She participated in these conversations, nodding along with their outrage while fighting the urge to confess everything. The investigation began with interviews of every staff member who had access to the Queen's private quarters. Crawford started with the cleaning staff, then moved on to the personal assistants and finally to the guards. Camilla knew her turn was coming, and she spent sleepless nights rehearsing her responses to questions she knew would be asked. Marcus sensed something was wrong when his mother stopped answering his calls. When he finally reached her, she was nearly hysterical with worry. She explained about the inventory and the investigation, and both of them realized the gravity of their situation. The items they had stolen weren't just valuable objects, but irreplaceable pieces of royal history. The security cameras were the first concrete lead in the investigation. Crawford and his team spent hours reviewing footage from the corridors leading to the Queen's chambers. They focused on the weeks immediately following the Queen's death, when security protocols had been somewhat relaxed due to the funeral preparations. Camilla appeared on the cameras multiple times during her regular patrol duties, which was completely normal and expected. However, the investigators noticed that her behavior had changed subtly over the weeks in question. Her body language seemed more nervous, and she appeared to be glancing around more frequently, as if checking to see if anyone was watching her. The breakthrough came when Crawford decided to examine the footage more carefully during the overnight shifts when fewer people were around. He discovered a particular night when Camilla had lingered in the corridor outside the Queen's chambers longer than usual. The camera angle didn't show exactly what she was doing, but her movements were suspicious enough to warrant further investigation. Crawford called Camilla in for her official interview on a gray Thursday morning. She sat across from him in a small office, trying to control her trembling hands as he asked routine questions about her duties and observations during the weeks following the Queen's death. She answered as honestly as she could about everything except her own criminal activities. The security director was an experienced investigator who had dealt with internal theft cases before. He watched Camilla's reactions carefully, noting the way she avoided eye contact when discussing her access to the Queen's chambers. Her answers were technically correct, but lacked the natural flow of someone telling the complete truth. After the initial interview, Crawford decided to focus the investigation more narrowly on the palace guards, who had the most access and opportunity. Camilla was among 3 guards who were asked to submit to more detailed questioning and to provide alibis for specific times when the thefts might have occurred. The pressure was becoming unbearable for both Camilla and Marcus. She could barely eat or sleep, and her performance at work was noticeably affected. Her fellow guards began to comment on her appearance and behavior, asking if she was feeling unwell. The irony of their concern and support made her guilt even more painful to bear. Marcus tried to convince his mother that they should destroy any remaining evidence and maintain their innocence. He argued that without concrete proof, the investigators couldn't prosecute them successfully, but Camilla was beginning to crack under the psychological pressure of lying to people who had trusted her for years. The investigation took a decisive turn when Crawford decided to bring in external forensics experts to examine the Queen's chambers for fingerprints and DNA evidence. Modern technology made it possible to detect traces that might have been left behind during the thefts. This news terrified Camilla because she knew her prints were legitimately all over the Queen's chambers from her regular duties. But the timing and location of certain prints might reveal her criminal activities. Crawford also expanded the investigation to include financial records of all palace staff. He obtained warrants to examine bank accounts and spending patterns, looking for any unusual deposits or purchases that might indicate someone had recently come into unexplained money. This development made both Camilla and Marcus realize that their financial activities would eventually be scrutinized. The forensics team found several interesting pieces of evidence, including partial fingerprints on surfaces where they wouldn't normally be expected from routine guard duties. They also discovered tiny fabric fibers that had apparently been snagged on one of the Queen's jewelry boxes, fibers that didn't match any of the standard palace cleaning cloths or the Queen's own clothing. As the investigation intensified, Camilla found herself struggling to maintain her facade. She made small mistakes during her shifts, forgot routine procedures, and became increasingly isolated from her colleagues. The stress was taking a visible toll on her health and mental state, creating a downward spiral that made her behavior even more suspicious to Crawford's trained eye. The security director was now convinced that the thief was someone with intimate knowledge of palace routines and security procedures. The careful selection of items and the timing of the thefts indicated someone who understood exactly when and how to avoid detection. This narrowed his focus even further to the inner circle of staff who had both access and expertise. Camilla received a call at home one evening informing her that she needed to report for additional questioning the following morning. Crawford's voice was more serious than before, and she sensed that the investigation was closing in on her. That night she sat with Marcus and finally admitted that she didn't think she could continue lying much longer. The weight of their secret had become too heavy to bear, and both of them knew that their lives were about to change dramatically. The money they had gained from selling the Queen's possessions now felt like a curse rather than a blessing, and they were beginning to understand that some mistakes have consequences that extend far beyond anything they had imagined. The morning of Camilla's second interrogation arrived like a death sentence. She barely managed to eat breakfast, Her stomach twisted in knots as she prepared for what she suspected would be her final day as a palace guard. Marcus had stayed up with her most of the night, both of them alternating between panic and desperate hope that somehow they might still escape consequences. Director Crawford had spent the previous evening reviewing all the evidence his team had gathered. The financial investigation had revealed some interesting patterns in both Camilla's and Marcus's recent banking activities. While neither had made any obviously suspicious large deposits, there had been several smaller transactions that, when viewed together, painted a picture of people suddenly having more disposable income than their legitimate sources should have provided. The forensics report had also yielded crucial information. The fabric fibers found on the Queen's jewelry box had been analyzed and matched to the specific type of wool used in the Royal Guard uniforms. Even more damning microscopic analysis revealed traces of hand cream that contained a distinctive combination of ingredients found in the brand that palace staff were provided for their personal use. Camilla walked into the interview room. She could see immediately that something had changed in Crawford's demeanor. He was no longer conducting a routine inquiry, but seemed to be preparing for a confrontation. The presence of a second investigator and what appeared to be legal recording equipment made it clear that this meeting would be far more serious than the previous one. Crawford began by reviewing Camilla's previous statements, asking her to confirm details about her duties and movements during the relevant time period. She repeated her earlier answers, trying to sound confident, while her heart pounded so loudly she was certain everyone in the room could hear it. The security director nodded thoughtfully, making notes that seemed to carry significant weight. Then Crawford shifted his approach entirely. He placed several photographs on the table between them, showing the missing items in their original locations within the Queen's chambers. He asked Camilla if she recognized these pieces and whether she had ever handled them during her official duties. Her mouth went dry as she looked at images of the brooch pen and other items she had stolen. She tried to answer carefully, acknowledging that she might have seen these items during her patrols, but claiming no specific memory of handling them. Crawford watched her reaction closely, noting the way her voice wavered and how she seemed to be choosing her words with unusual care. He had interviewed hundreds of people over his career and recognized the signs of someone hiding important information. The second investigator then presented the forensics evidence, explaining how they had found fabric fibers and other traces that suggested someone in a guard uniform had handled the Queen's personal possessions in ways that went beyond normal security protocols. Camilla felt her face flush as she realized how much evidence they had actually gathered against her. Crawford's next question hit like a physical blow. He asked directly whether Camilla had taken anything from the Queen's chambers, explaining that they now had evidence strongly suggesting that someone with her level of access had committed the thefts. The room fell silent as she struggled to find words, her carefully prepared denials crumbling under the weight of the evidence being presented. For several long minutes, Camilla sat speechless, staring at the photographs and trying to process the fact that her crimes had been discovered. The investigators waited patiently, understanding that they had reached a critical moment in the interrogation. The silence stretched on, broken only by the quiet hum of the recording equipment. Finally, the dam burst. Tears streaming down her face, Camilla began to confess. The words came out in a rush, as if a massive pressure had been released. She admitted to taking the items, explained her son's desperate financial situation, and described how one theft had led to another, until she found herself trapped in a web of lies and criminal activity. Crawford listened without interruption as Camilla detailed each theft, the methods she had used to avoid detection, and the buyers they had found for the stolen goods. Her confession was thorough and devastating, revealing the full scope of their crimes and the calculated nature of their activities over several weeks. The revelation that Marcus had been involved as an accomplice shocked the investigators. They had focused their attention on palace staff and hadn't considered that someone outside the organization might be participating in the thefts. This expanded the scope of the case significantly and introduced additional legal complications. When Camilla finished her confession, Crawford informed her that she was being placed under arrest and would be terminated from her position effective immediately. Palace security escorted her from the building, and she found herself standing outside the gates that had been like a second home for 12 years. The reality of her situation was beginning to sink in, and she felt overwhelmed by the magnitude of what she had lost. Marcus was arrested at his apartment later that same day. The police had obtained warrants based on Camilla's confession, and they found additional evidence of the stolen goods in his possession, including receipts from some of the sales transactions. His newly furnished apartment and recent purchases provided further proof of their criminal activities. The legal proceedings moved quickly once both suspects were in custody. The palace wanted the matter resolved discreetly to avoid negative publicity, but the serious nature of the crimes meant that significant penalties were inevitable. Both Camilla and Marcus were charged with theft, fraud, and conspiracy, charges that carried substantial prison sentences. The story leaked to the media within days, creating a sensation that reached far beyond the palace walls. Newspapers ran headlines about the trusted guard who had betrayed the Queen's memory, and television news programs discussed the case as an example of how financial desperation could corrupt even the most loyal employees. The public reaction was overwhelmingly negative, with many people expressing outrage that someone would steal from the deceased monarch. Camilla's former colleagues felt deeply betrayed by her actions. Many of them had considered her a friend and had trusted her with their own secrets over the years. The revelation that she had been stealing while they mourned the Queen together seemed particularly cruel and calculating. Several guards requested transfers to different duties, saying they felt uncomfortable working in the same areas where the thefts had occurred. The royal family issued a brief statement expressing their disappointment and sadness over the betrayal of trust. They emphasized that the vast majority of palace staff were honest and dedicated individuals who served with honor, but they also made it clear that criminal behavior would not be tolerated, regardless of an employee's previous service. Record legal experts who followed the case predicted that both Camilla and Marcus would face significant prison time given the high-profile nature of their victims and the calculated way they had carried out their crimes. The fact that they had stolen from a deceased person who had shown them kindness made their actions particularly difficult to defend in court. As they sat in their separate jail cells awaiting trial, both mother and son had time to reflect on how quickly their lives had changed. The money that had seemed like a solution to their problems now felt like a curse that had cost them everything they valued. Camilla thought about the Queen's kindness and how she had repaid that generosity with theft and betrayal. The investigation continued as authorities worked to recover as many of the stolen items as possible. Some pieces had already been resold multiple times and would be difficult to trace, while others were recovered from the dealers who had purchased them directly from Marcus. The royal family faced the painful reality that some of the Queen's personal possessions might be lost forever. The case became a cautionary tale about how financial pressure and poor judgment could destroy lives and relationships that had taken years to build. Palace security implemented new protocols to prevent similar incidents, but the damage to the institution's reputation and the betrayal felt by the royal family would take much longer to heal. The trial of Camilla Richardson and her son Marcus became one of the most closely watched court proceedings of the year. Media outlets from around the world sent reporters to cover the case of the royal guard who had stolen from the Queen's personal collection. The courthouse was surrounded by photographers and journalists every day, creating a circus atmosphere that added to the defendant's humiliation. Camilla's lawyer, a public defender named Sarah Mitchell, faced an almost impossible task. Her client had confessed to the crimes, and there was overwhelming physical evidence linking her to the thefts. The best strategy available was to argue for leniency based on Camilla's previous good character and the financial desperation that had driven her to crime. However, the public nature of the case and the identity of the victim made sympathy difficult to generate. Marcus had hired a private attorney using money from the thefts, a decision that backfired spectacularly when the prosecution pointed out the irony during their opening statements. His lawyer, David Chen, attempted to argue that his client had been manipulated by his mother and was merely following her lead out of filial loyalty. This strategy created tension between the defendants and their legal teams, as it required throwing Camilla under the bus to potentially save Marcus. The prosecution was led by Crown Prosecutor Elizabeth Warren, a veteran attorney known for her meticulous preparation and ruthless efficiency in high-profile cases. She painted the defendants as calculating criminals who had exploited their trusted positions to betray not just the royal family, but the entire nation. Her opening statement emphasized how Camilla had violated the sacred trust placed in her as a protector of the monarchy. The evidence presented during the first week of trial was devastating for the defense. Security camera footage showed Camilla's suspicious behavior during her night shifts. Forensic evidence linked her directly to the crime scenes, and financial records demonstrated how both defendants had benefited from the stolen goods. The prosecution methodically built an airtight case that left little room for reasonable doubt. One of the most damaging pieces of evidence was Camilla's own confession, which was played in its entirety for the jury. Her tearful admission of guilt, recorded during her interrogation, provided a complete roadmap of how the crimes were committed. The jurors listened in stunned silence as she described her decision-making process and the gradual escalation from a single theft to an ongoing criminal enterprise. The testimony from Camilla's former colleagues was particularly painful for her to hear. Guard after guard took the witness stand to describe their shock and betrayal upon learning of her crimes. Several broke down in tears as they recounted how they had trusted her with their personal problems and considered her almost like family. Their words painted a picture of someone who had not only stolen objects, but had also destroyed relationships and violated the bonds of professional fellowship. Director Crawford's testimony was clinical and professional, but it highlighted the extensive damage caused by the thefts. Beyond the monetary value of the stolen items, he explained how the crimes had forced a complete review of palace security protocols and had shaken the confidence of the entire staff. The royal family had been personally devastated by the betrayal, particularly given their previous kindness to both defendants. The most shocking revelation during the trial came when prosecutors revealed the full extent of the defendants' criminal activities. They had not only stolen the initially discovered items, but had also taken several additional pieces that hadn't been missed during the first inventory. The total value of their thefts exceeded £200,000, making this a far more serious crime than initially understood. Marcus took the witness stand in his own defense, a decision that proved disastrous. Under cross-examination, he came across as entitled and unremorseful, claiming that his financial situation had justified their actions. When asked directly if he felt any guilt about stealing from the deceased queen, his hesitant response suggested he was more sorry about getting caught than about the crimes themselves. Camilla's testimony was more emotional and appeared more genuine, but it couldn't overcome the fundamental facts of the case. She spoke about her love for her son and her desperation to help him avoid homelessness, but the prosecution effectively countered by pointing out that many parents face financial struggles without resorting to theft. Her tears seemed authentic, but they couldn't undo the calculated nature of her crimes. The defense attempted to call character witnesses to speak about Camilla's previous good service, but most of her former colleagues refused to testify on her behalf. The few who did agree to speak were clearly uncomfortable, and their testimony felt half-hearted. The betrayal was too fresh and too complete for them to offer wholehearted support, even for someone they had once considered a friend. Expert witnesses testified about the historical and cultural significance of the stolen items, explaining how some pieces had been in the royal collection for generations and held value far beyond their monetary worth. One particularly moving testimony came from a royal historian who described how the queen had cherished certain items because of their personal significance and family history. The prosecution's closing argument was a masterpiece of legal rhetoric that left the courtroom in stunned silence. Warren methodically reviewed the evidence while emphasizing the broader implications of the defendants' actions. She argued that their crimes represented not just theft, but a fundamental attack on the institutions and traditions that bound British society together. The defense's closing arguments felt weak by comparison, relying heavily on appeals for mercy rather than substantive legal arguments. Mitchell did her best to humanize Camilla and explain the desperate circumstances that had led to her poor choices, but the weight of evidence and public opinion was overwhelmingly against her client. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all charges for both defendants. The speed of their decision reflected the overwhelming evidence and the clear-cut nature of the case. As the verdicts were read, Camilla collapsed in her chair while Marcus sat stone-faced, apparently still not fully grasping the reality of his situation. The sentencing hearing was scheduled for 2 weeks later, giving both sides time to prepare their arguments about appropriate punishment. The prosecution indicated they would seek significant prison terms to send a clear message about the consequences of betraying public trust. The defense teams began preparing mitigation arguments, though they had little hope of avoiding substantial incarceration. Public reaction to the guilty verdicts was overwhelmingly supportive, with most commentators agreeing that justice had been served. However, there were some voices calling for understanding and mercy, particularly for Camilla, who was seen by some as a victim of circumstances rather than a hardened criminal. These minority opinions did little to shift the overall narrative of the case. The royal family issued another statement expressing satisfaction with the verdict, while emphasizing their continued faith in the vast majority of palace staff who served with honor and integrity. They also announced that additional security measures would be implemented to prevent similar incidents in the future, though they declined to provide specific details for obvious reasons. As Camilla and Marcus returned to their jail cells to await sentencing, both faced the reality that their lives had been permanently altered by their choices. The money they had stolen was gone, either spent or used to pay legal fees, and they now faced years in prison. The relationship between mother and son had been strained by the competing legal strategies their attorneys had employed, adding personal betrayal to their list of losses. The media continued to dissect every aspect of the case with particular focus on how trusted employees could fall so far from grace. Security experts appeared on television programs to discuss the broader implications for other high-security organizations, while psychologists debated the mental processes that could lead ordinary people to commit such extraordinary crimes. The case had become more than just a criminal trial. It had evolved into a national conversation about trust, desperation, and the price of betraying the institutions that define a society. As the sentencing date approached, everyone involved knew that the final chapter of this tragic story would set important precedents for how such cases would be handled in the future. The sentencing hearing arrived on a dreary autumn morning, with protesters gathered outside the courthouse holding signs demanding severe punishment for the defendants. The case had become a symbol of broader social issues, with some viewing Camilla and Marcus as representatives of economic inequality, while others saw them as ungrateful criminals who had betrayed the ultimate trust. Judge Margaret Thornton, a senior magistrate with 30 years of experience, presided over the sentencing with the gravity the case deserved. She had spent weeks reviewing precedent cases, victim impact statements, and psychological evaluations of both defendants. The weight of public attention and the unique nature of the crimes made this one of the most significant decisions of her career. The prosecution presented their sentencing recommendation first, with Crown Prosecutor Warren arguing for substantial prison terms that would serve both as punishment and deterrent. She emphasized that crimes against the royal family represented attacks on British institutions themselves and required harsh consequences to maintain public confidence in the justice system. Her recommendation was 8 years for Camilla and 6 years for Marcus, reflecting their respective roles in the conspiracy. Victim impact statements were read on behalf of the royal family and palace staff, though the family members themselves did not appear in court. The statements described the profound sense of betrayal felt by everyone who had worked with Camilla, and the personal pain experienced by family members who had lost irreplaceable mementos of their beloved queen. Several statements specifically mentioned how the thefts had violated not just legal boundaries, but sacred emotional ones. The most powerful victim impact statement came from Lady Catherine Windsor, the Queen's youngest granddaughter, who had been particularly close to her grandmother. Through her representative, she described how learning of the thefts had tainted her memories of visiting the Queen's private chambers and seeing the personal items that connected the family to their history. The statement noted that some stolen pieces had been gifts from deceased family members, making their loss particularly devastating. Camilla's defense team presented extensive mitigation evidence, including testimony from a psychiatrist who had evaluated her mental state during the crimes. The expert testified that Camilla had been suffering from severe anxiety and depression related to her son's financial crisis, conditions that had impaired her judgment and decision-making ability. However, the prosecution successfully argued that mental distress did not excuse calculated criminal behavior. Character witnesses finally came forward for Camilla, including several community members who had known her before her employment at the palace. They described a generous woman who had volunteered at local charities and helped neighbors in need. Her parish priest testified about her regular church attendance and contributions to food banks, painting a picture that seemed inconsistent with the calculating criminal portrayed by prosecutors. Marcus's defense team struggled to find similar character witnesses, as his more limited life experience provided fewer opportunities for community service. His university professors provided lukewarm testimonials about his academic ability, but none could speak to his moral character with any conviction. This disparity in community support highlighted the different trajectories that had led mother and son to their current predicament. The psychological evaluation of Marcus revealed troubling patterns of entitlement and rationalization that concerned the court. Unlike his mother, who showed genuine remorse for her actions, Marcus continued to justify the thefts as necessary responses to an unfair economic system. His inability to accept full responsibility for his choices suggested a likelihood of reoffending if given the opportunity. Financial restitution became a major issue during sentencing discussions. The prosecution calculated that the defendants owed nearly £300,000 when interest, legal costs, and the value of items that couldn't be recovered were included. Neither defendant had any realistic ability to pay such amounts, making monetary punishment largely symbolic rather than practical. Judge Thornton questioned both defendants directly before announcing her sentence, giving them final opportunities to address the court. Camilla's statement was brief and tearful, expressing genuine remorse and acknowledging the pain she had caused to everyone affected by her crimes. She specifically apologized to her former colleagues and to the royal family for betraying their trust. Marcus's final statement was less convincing, focusing more on his own suffering and the circumstances that had led to his involvement, rather than the harm caused to others. His defensive tone and continued attempts to minimize his role left a poor impression on everyone present, including his own legal team. The contrast between his attitude and his mother's acceptance of responsibility was stark and noted by observers. The judge's sentencing decision reflected careful consideration of all factors presented during the proceedings. She acknowledged Camilla's previous good character and genuine remorse while emphasizing that her position of trust made her crimes particularly serious. The calculated nature of the thefts over several weeks demonstrated that these were not impulsive acts but deliberate choices that required substantial punishment. Camilla was sentenced to 6 years in prison, with the possibility of parole after serving 4 years if she demonstrated continued good behavior and genuine rehabilitation. The judge noted that her cooperation with investigators and full confession had resulted in a somewhat reduced sentence, though the seriousness of her crimes still warranted significant incarceration. Marcus received a 5-year sentence with eligibility for parole after 3 years. Though the judge expressed skepticism about his prospects for rehabilitation, given his continued attitude problems, she specifically noted his apparent lack of genuine remorse and his tendency to blame others for his situation, factors that would be considered in any future parole hearings. Both defendants were also banned permanently from any employment involving positions of trust or access to valuable property. This lifetime restriction would severely limit their future career options and serve as a constant reminder of the consequences of their choices. The judge explained that society needed protection from individuals who had demonstrated willingness to exploit trusted positions for personal gain. The courtroom was silent as the sentences were announced, with Camilla breaking down completely while Marcus sat in stunned disbelief. The reality of spending years in prison had apparently not fully registered with him until that moment. Their legal teams immediately began discussing appeal options, though both attorneys privately acknowledged that the sentences were within reasonable ranges given the circumstances. Media reaction to the sentences was mixed, with some commentators arguing they were too lenient while others felt they appropriately balanced justice with mercy. Legal experts generally agreed that Judge Thornton had crafted sentences that reflected the unique circumstances of the case while establishing clear precedents for future prosecutions of similar crimes. The royal family issued a final statement expressing satisfaction with the court's decision and their hope that the defendants would use their prison time for genuine reflection and rehabilitation. They also announced the creation of a hardship fund for palace employees facing financial difficulties, hoping to prevent future desperation from leading to similar criminal choices. As Camilla and Marcus were led away to begin their sentences, both faced the daunting prospect of years behind bars. The money they had stolen was gone, their reputations destroyed, and their relationship with each other strained by the competing legal strategies that had portrayed them as mutual betrayers. The quick path to financial relief they had chosen had ultimately led to the loss of everything they valued. The prison system would now become their new reality, with all the challenges and dangers that environment presented. Camilla, as a former law enforcement officer, would face particular risks from other inmates who viewed her as a traitor to the justice system. Marcus would have to navigate prison politics while dealing with his own psychological issues and the consequences of his poor choices. Their story had become a cautionary tale that would be studied in criminology courses and discussed in ethics classes for years to come. The case demonstrated how quickly respected individuals could fall from grace when faced with desperate circumstances and poor judgment. It also highlighted the far-reaching consequences of betraying institutional trust in a society that depends on the integrity of its public servants. The palace implemented new security protocols and employee support systems designed to prevent similar incidents, but the damage to institutional confidence would take years to repair. Every future employee would be reminded of Camilla and Marcus Richardson as examples of how not to handle financial difficulties and personal crises. As the courthouse emptied and the media circus moved on to other stories, the two defendants began their journey into a prison system that would test their character in ways they had never imagined. The easy money was gone, their freedom was lost, and they faced the long, difficult process of trying to rebuild their lives from the ruins of their own making. Prison life proved far more brutal than either Camilla or Marcus had anticipated during their comfortable middle-class lives. They were separated and sent to different facilities, with Camilla assigned to Holloway Women's Prison and Marcus to Pentonville. The immediate shock of their new environment was overwhelming, as both struggled to adapt to the harsh realities of incarceration among hardened criminals. Camilla faced particular challenges as a former law enforcement officer. Prison inmates had their own code of justice, and those who had worked for the system were viewed with suspicion and hostility. Within her first week, she was confronted by several inmates who had recognized her from news coverage of the trial. The notoriety of her case made anonymity impossible, and she quickly became a target for both verbal abuse and physical intimidation. Her cellmate was a career criminal named Janet Shaw, who had served multiple sentences for fraud and theft. Janet initially seemed friendly, but Camilla soon realized this was a calculated attempt to extract information that could be used against her. The veteran inmate peppered her with questions about her crimes and her life before prison, clearly looking for weaknesses that could be exploited later. The daily routine of prison life was a dramatic departure from Camilla's structured existence as a palace guard. She was assigned to work in the prison laundry, spending long hours in steamy, uncomfortable conditions while processing institutional clothing and linens. The work was monotonous and physically demanding, a far cry from the purposeful nature of her previous security duties. Marcus faced different but equally serious challenges at Pentonville. As a young, educated inmate convicted of high-profile crimes, he was viewed by some as an easy target and by others as someone who thought himself superior to the general prison population. His attempts to maintain distance from other inmates were interpreted as arrogance, leading to confrontations that tested his ability to survive in the hostile environment. The psychological impact of imprisonment hit both defendants harder than they had expected. Camilla, who had always taken pride in her integrity and service, struggled with the reality that she was now classified as a common criminal. Depression set in quickly, exacerbated by the loss of purpose and the constant reminder of her fall from grace. She spent many nights lying awake in her narrow bunk, replaying the decisions that had led to her current situation. Marcus initially tried to maintain his previous lifestyle mentally, refusing to accept that his circumstances had changed permanently. He complained constantly about prison conditions, the quality of food, and his treatment by guards and fellow inmates. This attitude made him extremely unpopular and led to several altercations that resulted in disciplinary action and extended periods in solitary confinement. Both Mother and son were allowed limited contact with each other through supervised phone calls and occasional visits. These conversations were strained and often ended in arguments about their respective situations and who bore greater responsibility for their shared downfall. The emotional distance between them grew as they each struggled with their own survival and adaptation to prison life. The legal appeals process provided some hope initially, but their attorneys soon delivered disappointing news. The evidence against them had been overwhelming. Their confessions had been properly obtained, and the sentences fell within established guidelines for similar crimes. The appellate courts found no grounds for overturning their convictions or substantially reducing their sentences. Camilla eventually found some measure of peace through the prison chaplaincy program. Father Michael O'Brien, a Catholic priest who had ministered to inmates for over 20 years, became a regular counselor and spiritual advisor. Through their sessions, she began to confront the full magnitude of her betrayal and started the long process of genuine repentance and self-reflection. The chaplain encouraged Camilla to write letters of apology to those she had wronged, including her former colleagues at the palace and members of the royal family. These letters were never sent, as security protocols prevented direct communication, but the process of writing them helped her understand the full impact of her actions on real people who had trusted and cared for her. Marcus proved more resistant to rehabilitation efforts. He attended mandatory counseling sessions but showed little willingness to engage meaningfully with the process. His counselor, Dr. Sarah Roberts, noted in her reports that he continued to externalize blame and showed minimal empathy for his victims. This attitude would likely impact his parole eligibility when the time came for review. The media attention gradually faded as other scandals and stories captured public interest. But both defendants found that their notoriety within the prison system persisted. New inmates arriving at their respective facilities often recognized them from news coverage, ensuring that they could never entirely escape the consequences of their public shame. Camilla's health began to deteriorate under the stress of prison life. She developed chronic headaches and digestive problems that the prison medical staff attributed to anxiety and depression. The substandard health care available to inmates meant that her conditions were managed rather than treated, adding physical suffering to her emotional distress. Family relationships outside prison also suffered dramatically. Camilla's elderly parents, who had always been proud of their daughter's respectable career, were devastated by the scandal. Her father suffered a mild heart attack shortly after her sentencing, which doctors attributed partly to the stress of the situation. Her mother withdrew from social activities, unable to face the judgment and gossip of their small community. Marcus lost contact with most of his university friends, who distanced themselves from association with his crimes. His girlfriend, who had initially promised to wait for him, ended their relationship after 6 months when the social pressure became too much to bear. The isolation left him increasingly bitter and resentful toward everyone he blamed for his situation. The prison education system offered some opportunities for both defendants to use their time constructively. Camilla enrolled in a business studies course, hoping to develop skills that might help her find employment after release. However, her criminal record and the lifetime ban from positions of trust severely limited her future career options. Marcus initially refused to participate in educational programs, considering them beneath his university education. Eventually, boredom and the realization that he needed to demonstrate rehabilitation efforts for parole consideration convinced him to enroll in a computer programming course. His attitude toward his instructors and fellow students remained condescending and problematic. Both defendants began to understand that their sentences represented only the beginning of their punishment. The real consequences of their choices would extend far beyond their prison terms, affecting their relationships, career prospects, and social standing for the rest of their lives. The quick money they had gained from their crimes had cost them everything that truly mattered. As they settled into the routine of long-term incarceration, both Camilla and Marcus faced the daunting realization that they would need to completely rebuild their identities and life plans. The people they had been before their crimes were gone forever, and the people they would become after release remained uncertain. The path to redemption, if one existed, would be far longer and more difficult than either had imagined when they first decided to steal from the Queen's personal collection. 3.5 years into their sentences, Both Camilla and Marcus had become different people than they were when they entered prison. The harsh reality of incarceration had stripped away many of their previous assumptions about life, forcing them to confront fundamental questions about character, responsibility, and redemption that they had never seriously considered before. Camilla had undergone the more dramatic transformation. Her work with Father O'Brien had led to genuine spiritual awakening and acceptance of responsibility for her actions. She had become a mentor to younger inmates, helping them navigate prison life while encouraging them to make better choices than she had. Her reputation within Holloway had evolved from that of a notorious criminal to a respected voice for rehabilitation and personal growth. The parole board review process began 6 months before her earliest possible release date. Camilla prepared extensively with her counselors, understanding that demonstrating genuine rehabilitation would be crucial to gaining her freedom. Her prison record showed consistent good behavior, participation in educational programs, and meaningful engagement with counseling services. Most importantly, she had maintained steady correspondence with Father O'Brien and showed clear evidence of understanding the impact of her crimes. Marcus's path had been far more difficult. His resistance to accepting responsibility had resulted in several disciplinary incidents and extended periods in solitary confinement. His counselors noted minimal progress in addressing his underlying attitude problems and tendency to blame others for his situation. As his parole review approached, his prospects for early release appeared slim. The parole hearing for Camilla took place on a cold February morning, exactly 4 years after her original sentencing. She appeared before the 3-member board with her legal representative and Father O'Brien, who had agreed to serve as her spiritual advisor and community contact. The board members had thoroughly reviewed her case file, including psychological evaluations, prison conduct reports, and victim impact statements. Board Chairman Robert Davidson questioned Camilla extensively about her crimes and their impact on her victims. Her responses demonstrated clear understanding of the harm she had caused and genuine remorse for her actions. When asked about her plans for reintegration into society, she outlined realistic goals, focused on finding modest employment and contributing to her community through volunteer work. Father O'Brien testified about Camilla's spiritual transformation and his willingness to provide ongoing support and supervision. He had arranged for her to live in a church-sponsored halfway house and had identified potential employment opportunities through parish connections. His testimony emphasized her genuine repentance and commitment to making amends for her past actions. The victim impact statements were read again, reminding the board of the profound betrayal felt by the royal family and palace staff. However, one new statement had been added from Lady Catherine Windsor, acknowledging Camilla's letters of apology and expressing cautious hope that she had genuinely changed. This gesture of forgiveness carried significant weight with the board members. After deliberating for 2 hours, the parole board granted Camilla's release with strict conditions. She would be required to live in approved housing, maintain regular employment, submit to frequent monitoring by parole officers, and continue counseling sessions. Any violation of these conditions would result in immediate return to prison to serve the remainder of her sentence. Marcus faced his parole board 3 weeks later under far different circumstances. His prison record showed multiple disciplinary infractions, minimal participation in rehabilitation programs, and continued problems with authority figures. His psychological evaluations indicated ongoing denial and blame shifting that suggested high risk of reoffending if released early. The parole board questioned Marcus about his understanding of his crimes and their impact on victims. His responses were technically correct, but lacked the emotional depth and genuine remorse that had characterized his mother's testimony. When asked about his future plans, his answers seemed focused on returning to his previous lifestyle, rather than demonstrating meaningful change or acceptance of responsibility. Marcus's parole application was denied unanimously, with the board citing his failure to demonstrate genuine rehabilitation and continued risk to public safety. He would need to serve his full sentence before being eligible for release, and even then would face strict supervision conditions. The decision devastated him, as he had convinced himself that his cooperation with prison programs would be sufficient to secure early release. Camilla was released from Holloway Prison on a rainy spring morning, carrying her few possessions in a paper bag provided by the prison system. Father O'Brien met her at the gates, driving her to St. Mary's halfway house, where she would begin the difficult process of rebuilding her life. The transition from prison to the outside world proved challenging, as she struggled with basic decisions and social interactions after years of institutional control. Her first weeks of freedom were marked by intense anxiety and difficulty sleeping in her small room at the halfway house. The constant noise and activity of London streets felt overwhelming after the structured quiet of prison life. Simple tasks like shopping for groceries or using public transportation required conscious effort and planning that had once been automatic. Employment proved to be the most significant challenge. Despite her education and work experience, her criminal record and the notoriety of her case made finding jobs extremely difficult. Most employers rejected her applications immediately upon discovering her background. Those few who were willing to interview her often changed their minds after recognizing her name or face from media coverage. Eventually, Camilla found work at a small cleaning company owned by a former convict who understood the challenges faced by ex-offenders. The job paid minimum wage and involved long hours of physical labor, but it provided legitimate income and a sense of purpose. Her colleagues initially viewed her with suspicion, but her work ethic and humble attitude gradually earned their respect. The relationship with her son remained strained during his continued incarceration. Marcus blamed Camilla for their situation, arguing that her initial theft had led him into criminal activity. Their phone conversations were often bitter and unproductive, with Marcus refusing to accept that his own choices had contributed to their downfall. This ongoing tension added to Camilla's emotional burden as she tried to rebuild her life. Camilla's parents, now in their 80s, had mixed feelings about her release. While they were relieved that she was safe and free, they struggled to reconcile their love for their daughter with their shame over her crimes. Their relationship slowly improved through regular visits and Camilla's obvious commitment to living an honest life. But the trust and pride they had once felt would never be fully restored. The royal family maintained their silence regarding Camilla's release, though security measures at all royal residences were quietly enhanced. The institutional memory of her betrayal remained strong within palace staff, serving as a constant reminder of the importance of maintaining security protocols and thoroughly vetting personnel with access to sensitive areas. Marcus finally completed his full sentence 2 years after his mother's release, emerging from prison bitter and largely unchanged. His inability to find stable employment or housing led to a series of poor decisions that eventually resulted in his rearrest for petty theft. The cycle of crime and incarceration that had begun with their royal thefts continued to define his life. Camilla learned of her son's new legal troubles through a phone call from his court-appointed attorney. The news devastated her, as she realized that despite her own rehabilitation, she had failed to help Marcus find a better path. She attended his sentencing hearing, watching from the gallery as he was sentenced to another 3 years in prison for his recent crimes. 5 years after her release, Camilla had established a modest but stable life working for the cleaning company and volunteering at a local charity that helped ex-offenders find employment. She lived alone in a small flat, maintaining contact with Father O'Brien and a few friends from her rehabilitation programs. Her existence was humble and unremarkable, but it was honest and purposeful. The scandal that had once dominated headlines was largely forgotten by the general public, though it occasionally resurfaced when similar cases involving breaches of trust made news. Camilla had become a case study in both the consequences of betraying institutional trust and the possibility of genuine rehabilitation and redemption after serious crimes. Her story served as a complex lesson about human nature, desperation, and the long-term consequences of moral failures. While she had found a measure of peace and purpose in her new life, the cost of her crimes continued to reverberate through her relationships and limited opportunities. The quick solution to financial problems that had seemed so appealing years earlier had ultimately destroyed the life she had built and forced her to create an entirely new identity based on humility and service to others. The royal family's possessions that had been recovered were returned to their proper places, but the sense of security and trust that had been violated could never be completely restored. Camilla Richardson's name would forever be associated with one of the most shocking betrayals in modern royal history. A reminder that even the most trusted servants are capable of profound moral failures when faced with desperate circumstances and poor judgment.